The small suburban neighborhood of Greenwood, Indiana, nestled just outside the bustling city of Indianapolis, was the kind of place where nothing truly bad ever happened. Streets lined with neatly trimmed lawns and pastel-colored houses gave an illusion of harmony. In one of these picture-perfect homes lived the Collins family, the embodiment of suburban bliss, or so it seemed. Catherine, Kate, Collins was the envy of her neighbors. A devoted mother to 2 children and a loving wife, she balanced PTA meetings with baking pies that always seemed to win first place at the town fair. Timothy, Tim, Collins, her husband, was the quintessential provider, a hard-working accountant whose long hours kept the family comfortably housed and enviably stable. Together, they appeared to be the American dream personified. But as is often the case, appearances can be deceiving. Beneath her flawless exterior, Kate harbored a side of herself that no one in Greenwood would ever suspect. Years of monotony in her marriage, of Tim's predictable routines and endless work trips, had left her craving excitement. This craving had led her down a dangerous path, a double life filled with clandestine rendezvous and secret lovers. She justified her actions as a necessary indulgence, a way to feel alive again. What harm could it cause if no one ever found out? Kate was meticulous. She covered her tracks so well that even Tim, a man who prided himself on his keen analytical mind, remained oblivious. That was until the night of March 15, 2023, a night that would shatter the fragile facade of their marriage. Tim had planned to surprise Kate by coming home early from a business trip. Exhausted but eager to see her, he parked his car in the driveway and quietly unlocked the front door. The house was eerily silent, with only the faint creak of floorboards above betraying any sign of life. Assuming Kate might already be in bed, he climbed the stairs with careful steps, not wanting to wake the kids. As he approached the bedroom, Tim noticed the door was slightly ajar, a sliver of light spilling out into the hallway. A flicker of unease settled in his chest. Slowly, he pushed the door open, just enough to peer inside. And then he saw them. Kate, his Kate, the woman he had cherished for over a decade, was tangled in bed with another man. Time seemed to stop. The air left Tim's lungs as if he'd been struck in the chest. He stood frozen in the doorway, unable to move, unable to think. His mind was a blank canvas, save for the image of betrayal that burned itself into his memory. Kate noticed him first. Her face drained of color, and her mouth fell open in a silent gasp. "Tim," she began, scrambling to push the man off her. But Tim couldn't hear her words. They were muffled echoes, meaningless in the face of what he'd just witnessed. Without a word, Tim turned and walked away. His steps were heavy, deliberate, as if he were dragging the weight of his broken heart with him. Kate's frantic voice called after him, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. The walls of their home, their sanctuary, now felt suffocating, poisoned by the betrayal that had unfolded within them. The cold night air hit Tim as he stepped outside, but it did nothing to clear the storm raging inside him. His mind replayed the scene over and over, each repetition slicing deeper into his soul. In that moment, one thing became painfully clear: the life he thought he knew, the woman he thought he loved, had been a lie. And lies, Tim would soon learn, have a way of unraveling everything. The days that followed were a blur of rage, confusion, and sleepless nights for Tim. He couldn't escape the haunting image of Kate with another man, her betrayal replaying in his mind like a relentless nightmare. The woman he had loved, trusted, and built his life with had shattered everything with a single act. But it wasn't just the betrayal, it was the years of deception that followed like a shadow, hiding in plain sight. Tim had always been analytical, methodical in his approach to life, work, and family. But now, that same meticulousness turned inward, into an obsessive need for answers. Why had Kate done this? How long had it been going on? How could he have been so blind? One night, while Kate was downstairs making dinner, he began searching through her phone. His hands trembled as he navigated through her messages and emails, expecting to find nothing. After all, Kate was always careful, too careful. But then he saw it, a string of text messages with a contact simply labeled D. The texts weren't explicit, but the intimacy in the language was unmistakable. Last night was perfect. Can't wait to see you again. Miss you already. Let me know when it's safe to call. The cold pit in Tim's stomach grew as he scrolled further. This wasn't the first time. The messages stretched back for months, then years. And D wasn't the only one. There were others. Flashes of names, each one like a dagger to his heart, revealed that Kate's infidelity wasn't a one-time mistake. It was a way of life. The realization hit him like a freight train: this wasn't the woman he thought he married. Kate had been living a double life for years, slipping away into shadows while he worked late nights and provided for their family. And Tim, he had been nothing but a fool, the last to know in a game everyone else seemed to be playing. The next morning, Tim confronted Kate. He hadn't slept, his eyes bloodshot and his voice raw. She tried to deny it at first, claiming the messages were misunderstood, but the evidence was too damning. When he pressed further, demanding names, dates, and reasons, she broke down in tears, admitting to several affairs but insisting she still loved him. Love? Tim spat the word like venom. You don't even know what that means. Was it love when you were sneaking around with them while I was working to keep this family afloat? Was it love when you let them into our home? Kate's tears didn't move him. For the first time in their marriage, he felt nothing but contempt for the woman standing before him. Her apologies, her promises to change, were nothing more than empty words. The damage was already done. But as the days passed, something darker began to fester inside Tim. His anger, once directed solely at Kate, began to shift. It wasn't just her fault, he reasoned. The men, those faceless, nameless intruders, had stolen something from him too. His marriage, his dignity, his very sense of self. They had invaded his life, taken what was his, and walked away without a care in the world. Late one night, as Tim sat in the living room nursing a glass of whiskey, Kate approached him. Her tone was soft, almost manipulative. I just want us to move on, Tim. We can't let this destroy us. Her words, meant to soothe, had the opposite effect. They ignited a spark of rage in him. Move on? As if nothing had happened? As if the years of lies could be swept under the rug? But even as the fury boiled within him, another thought took root, a chilling, calculated thought. Perhaps they could move on. But not until those men, those intruders, paid the price for what they had done. In the quiet of the night, as Kate retreated back to their bedroom, Tim began to plan. His mind, once clouded by anguish, now burned with clarity. He didn't just want answers anymore. He wanted justice, or at least, what he believed justice to be. The first name that came to mind was Daniel Price. The texts had made it clear that Daniel was more than just a fling. He was local, someone who knew the family, someone who had laughed in Tim's face while betraying him behind his back. The thought made Tim's blood boil. By the next morning, Tim was no longer the man who had silently walked out of his bedroom that fateful night. He was someone else entirely, someone who had nothing left to lose. And Daniel Price would soon be the first to feel the consequences. Daniel Price wasn't difficult to find. In a town like Greenwood, everyone's routines were predictable, and Daniel was no exception. Tim knew the man from casual interactions at the local gym, the occasional nod of acknowledgement when they crossed paths at community events. The thought of Daniel smiling at him, all while secretly betraying him, turned Tim's stomach. Over the next few days, Tim began watching Daniel. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for at first, maybe a sign, an opportunity, something that would tell him what to do next. But as he followed Daniel's daily routine, a dark clarity began to settle over him. Daniel's habits were alarmingly regular, morning coffee at the same diner, an hour at the gym in the evening, and late-night visits to his apartment just outside town. It was on the evening of March 20, 2023, when Tim made his decision. The day had been gray and cold, the kind of weather that hung heavy in the air. Tim sat in his car, parked across the street from the gym where Daniel was finishing his workout. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. A part of him screamed to turn back, to go home, to try and salvage whatever was left of his life. But that part of him was weak, and he had no patience left for weakness. As Daniel emerged from the gym, carrying a duffel bag slung over one shoulder, Tim stepped out of his car. He kept his head low, his movements deliberate but unhurried, like a predator stalking prey. "Hey, Daniel," Tim called, his voice calm, almost friendly. Daniel turned, surprised to see Tim but not alarmed. "Oh, hey, Tim. What's up?" Tim took a step closer, closing the distance between them. He could feel the weight of his decision pressing down on him, but he pushed it aside. "I need to talk to you," Tim said. His tone was steady, but there was a sharpness to it that made Daniel hesitate. "Sure," Daniel replied, glancing around nervously. "Is something wrong?" Tim smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You could say that." Before Daniel could respond, Tim's hand shot out, grabbing the towel draped over Daniel's shoulder. In one swift motion, he twisted it around Daniel's neck, pulling tight. Daniel dropped his duffel bag, his hands clawing at the towel as he struggled to breathe. The parking lot was deserted, the gym's lights casting long shadows across the asphalt. Daniel's muffled gasps filled the silence, his body jerking as he tried to fight back. Tim tightened his grip, his teeth clenched, his mind a storm of anger and grief. For a brief moment, Tim hesitated. This was a line he could never uncross, a step that would change him forever. But then he thought of Kate, of the years of lies, of the way Daniel had laughed with him while betraying him. The hesitation dissolved. As Daniel's struggles weakened, his body going limp, Tim felt a strange sense of release. The rage that had consumed him for days seemed to drain away, leaving only a cold emptiness. When it was over, he let the towel fall to the ground beside Daniel's lifeless body. Tim stepped back, his chest heaving, his mind racing. He stared down at Daniel's still form, the enormity of what he'd done slowly sinking in. The man who had taken everything from him was gone, but the sense of victory he'd expected never came. Instead, there was only silence, and the faint, creeping realization that this was far from over. He walked back to his car, his movements robotic, his hands trembling. As he drove away, he didn't look back. The darkness inside him, the part he had always suppressed, now felt like a companion, whispering promises of justice in his ear. Daniel Price was just the beginning. The rush of adrenaline from Daniel's death had faded by the time Tim pulled into his driveway that night. The quiet suburban street was as unremarkable as ever, the glow of porch lights and the faint hum of television sets seeping through the walls of nearby homes. It felt surreal to Tim that the world could look so normal when he had just committed the unthinkable. Inside, the house was silent. Kate was already in bed, or at least pretending to be. Tim stood in the living room, staring at the family photos hanging on the wall. They depicted a life he now realized had been nothing more than a facade, a carefully constructed lie that Kate had used to mask her betrayal. The anger simmered in his chest again, but now it was colder, more calculated. He poured himself a drink, the whiskey burning its way down his throat, and sat in the darkened room. His mind was a whirl of thoughts, but one idea stood out with chilling clarity: this wasn't over. Daniel had been the first, but there were others who had stolen pieces of his life, his dignity. They needed to pay too. The next morning, Tim returned to his routine as if nothing had happened. At breakfast, Kate hovered in the kitchen, her movements tense, her eyes darting toward him as if searching for a sign of what he might do next. Tim ignored her, keeping his expression neutral. He couldn't afford to let her suspect anything. His next target was David Harper, a local businessman who had been involved with Kate for nearly a year. The thought of David, a man who carried himself with an air of superiority, using Kate and walking away unscathed, filled Tim with a renewed sense of purpose. Tim began his research methodically. He combed through Kate's emails and texts, piecing together enough information to track David's routines. It didn't take long to discover that David often stayed at an upscale hotel in downtown Indianapolis during business trips. The hotel was discreet, the perfect place for someone like David to conduct his illicit affairs. On the evening of March 23, 2023, Tim drove to the city. He parked a few blocks away from the hotel, his heart pounding as he rehearsed what he would do. This time, there would be no hesitation, no second thoughts. He had crossed the line with Daniel, and there was no turning back now. Tim entered the hotel lobby, blending seamlessly with the other guests. He had learned enough from his snooping to know which room David was staying in. Using the excuse of delivering an urgent message, he convinced the receptionist to call David's room and let him up. When David opened the door, his face shifted from confusion to recognition, and then to fear. "Tim? What are you doing here?" Tim didn't answer. He stepped into the room, forcing David to back up. The door closed with a heavy thud, cutting off the world outside. "You think you can just take what's mine and walk away?" Tim's voice was low, steady, but it carried a dangerous edge that made David flinch. "Listen," David began, his hands raised in a placating gesture, "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. It was a mistake." "A mistake?" Tim's laugh was hollow, devoid of humor. "You think this is something you can just apologize for and move on?" David started to edge toward the door, but Tim blocked his path. The rage that had simmered inside him now erupted, a storm of pain and betrayal that demanded an outlet. Without thinking, Tim grabbed a lamp from the nightstand and swung it. The sound of shattering glass filled the room as the blow landed, and David crumpled to the floor. Tim stood over him, breathing heavily. The room was a mess, shards of the broken lamp scattered across the carpet, blood pooling beneath David's head. It was over, just like it had been with Daniel. And yet, just as before, the satisfaction Tim had expected never came. Instead, there was only the hollow emptiness that seemed to grow larger with every act of violence. He moved quickly, wiping down surfaces to erase any trace of his presence. Before leaving, he glanced down at David one last time. The man who had once seemed so untouchable now looked small, fragile, a reminder of how easily everything could be taken away. As Tim drove back to Greenwood, his mind raced. The weight of what he had done was beginning to press down on him, but he shoved it aside. There was still one more name on his list. And after Ryan Maxwell, there would be no loose ends. Or so he thought. The night was heavy with silence as Tim sat in his car, parked along the tree-lined road leading into Eagle Creek Park. He had arrived early, blending into the shadows of the secluded lot, his gaze fixed on the park's entrance. His target, Ryan Maxwell, was expected to arrive any minute now. Ryan, the final name on Tim's mental list of men who had taken from him what could never be returned, was known for his routine evening runs in the park's quiet trails. Tim had spent days preparing for this moment. He had studied Ryan's social media, tracked his movements, and pieced together enough details to ensure he would find him alone. There was no margin for error this time. He was determined to end it once and for all, to rid himself of the ghosts that haunted him. As the minutes ticked by, Tim's thoughts began to wander. He thought about the life he had built with Kate, their first home, the birth of their children, the shared dreams that now felt like distant memories. He had loved her with everything he had, only to discover she had been using him, betraying him, and laughing behind his back. The rage that had consumed him before now simmered beneath the surface, cold and calculated. The sudden beam of headlights snapped him back to the present. A car pulled into the lot and Tim watched as Ryan stepped out, stretching briefly before jogging toward the trailhead. Tim waited a few moments, then slipped out of his car, his footsteps silent as he followed. The trail wound through the dense trees, the faint sound of Ryan's shoes crunching against the gravel guiding Tim through the darkness. The park was deserted at this hour, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon filtering through the branches. Tim could hear his own breathing, steady and controlled, as he closed the distance between them. When he was close enough, he called out, his voice low but carrying enough weight to make Ryan stop. "Ryan." Ryan turned, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Tim? What are you doing here?" Tim stepped closer, his hands clenched into fists. "I've been waiting to talk to you." Ryan took a step back, his posture shifting to one of defense. "Look, I don't know what you've heard, but whatever it is, I'm sorry. I never meant to hurt anyone." "Sorry?" Tim's voice was ice. "You didn't think about that when you were sneaking around with my wife, did you?" Ryan's eyes darted around, searching for an escape route, but there was none. "Tim, listen to me. It wasn't like that. I didn't." "Save it," Tim snapped, cutting him off. "You don't get to justify what you did." The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to choke on. Tim stepped forward, his presence looming, forcing Ryan to stumble back. The fear in Ryan's eyes was unmistakable, and for a moment, Tim reveled in it. This was the power he had lost, the control that had been stolen from him. But then, something unexpected happened. Ryan's voice broke, trembling but sincere. "I didn't know, Tim. She never told me she was married. I swear. If I had known." Tim froze, his breath catching in his throat. The sincerity in Ryan's words cut through his anger, creating a crack in the wall of rage he had built around himself. For the first time, doubt crept in. Had all of this been orchestrated by Kate? Had she lied to everyone, not just to him? The realization hit him like a blow. He had been so consumed by his need for vengeance that he hadn't stopped to consider the possibility that Kate was the true puppet master. The thought made him stagger, his mind racing with conflicting emotions. Ryan, sensing the shift in Tim's demeanor, seized the moment to escape. He turned and bolted down the trail, his footsteps fading into the night. Tim didn't follow. He stood there, motionless, as the weight of his actions crashed down on him. For the first time, he saw himself not as a man seeking justice, but as a pawn in a game he hadn't even realized he was playing. Kate had manipulated him, fed his paranoia, and driven him to this breaking point. The men he had hunted, they were victims too, just like him. Tim sank to the ground, his hands trembling as he buried his face in them. He had crossed lines that could never be uncrossed, taken lives that could never be restored. And for what? For a woman who had destroyed him, piece by piece, with every lie she told. As he sat there in the darkness, the sound of distant sirens began to grow louder. He didn't move. He didn't run. He simply waited, resigned to the truth that the justice he sought had been an illusion all along. When the police arrived, they found Tim sitting in the dirt, his expression hollow, his voice barely above a whisper. "I did it," he said. "I killed them. But she made me do it." The officers exchanged glances but said nothing as they placed him in handcuffs. As they led him away, Tim's thoughts were consumed by one final question: would Kate ever face the consequences of her own actions? Or had she won the game she had been playing all along? The trial of Timothy Collins began on a brisk February morning in 2024, a year after the events that had shocked the quiet community of Greenwood. The courtroom buzzed with tension, packed with reporters, curious locals, and those who had once known the Collins family. Everyone wanted to hear how a mild-mannered accountant had spiraled into a string of brutal murders, and more importantly, whether his wife, Catherine, had been the mastermind behind it all. Tim sat at the defense table, a shadow of the man he once was. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, as though the weight of his actions had drained the very life from him. Across the room sat Kate, her expression composed but cold. Despite the mounting evidence against her, she played the role of a grieving wife, claiming she had no knowledge of Tim's crimes. The prosecution wasted no time painting Tim as a jealous, vengeful man who had let his emotions drive him to violence. They detailed the murders of Daniel Price, David Harper, and the failed attempt on Ryan Maxwell, laying out a clear pattern of premeditation. Fingerprints, surveillance footage, and witness testimony tied Tim to the crime scenes, leaving little doubt about his guilt. But the defense had a different story to tell. On the second day of the trial, Tim took the stand. The courtroom fell silent as he recounted his version of events, his voice trembling with a mix of shame and desperation. "I loved her," he began, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I built my entire life around her. But she wasn't the person I thought she was." He described the moment he discovered Kate's infidelity, the betrayal that shattered his world. He spoke of the texts, the emails, the years of lies he had uncovered. And then, with visible anguish, he revealed how Kate had manipulated him, planting seeds of paranoia and anger that grew into a consuming obsession. "She didn't tell me to do it outright," Tim admitted, his voice breaking. "But she knew what she was doing. She knew how to push me, how to make me believe it was the only way to make things right." The defense introduced a critical piece of evidence, Kate's diary, found hidden in the attic of their home. Its pages detailed her affairs, her disdain for Tim, and most damning of all, her calculated plan to use his love and jealousy to her advantage. "If I push him just right, he'll snap," one entry read. "He'll get rid of my problems for me." Gasps rippled through the courtroom as the diary was read aloud. The prosecution tried to argue that the entries were nothing more than the ramblings of a frustrated wife, but the defense countered with text messages and phone records that painted a chilling picture. Kate had fed Tim's insecurities, subtly encouraging his violent tendencies while maintaining her own innocence. On the fourth day, Ryan Maxwell, the surviving victim, took the stand. His testimony was crucial, not only for confirming Tim's guilt but also for exposing Kate's role in the tragedy. "She knew," Ryan said, his voice steady but filled with anger. "She told me she was married, but she made it sound like her husband was abusive, dangerous. She said she needed someone to care about her. But looking back, it was all lies. She was setting us both up." Kate's defense faltered under the weight of the evidence. Her composed demeanor began to crack as the prosecution pressed her on the diary, the texts, and her relationship with the victims. By the time closing arguments began, it was clear that she was no longer the grieving wife she had pretended to be but a calculated manipulator who had orchestrated the destruction of her own family. When the verdicts were read in April 2024, the courtroom was silent. Tim was found guilty on all counts of murder and sentenced to death. The judge acknowledged that he had been manipulated but emphasized that his actions were his own. As the sentence was announced, Tim sat motionless, his expression unreadable. He had confessed to his crimes, hoping for some semblance of peace, but instead, he felt only emptiness. Kate was found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder and sentenced to 20 years in prison. The judge called her actions cold, calculating, and devoid of humanity, condemning her for exploiting her husband's love and vulnerability. As she was led out of the courtroom, Kate maintained her icy composure, refusing to show any emotion. Tim watched her go, knowing he would never see her again, and yet he felt no relief. She had destroyed him, yes, but in the end, he had allowed himself to be destroyed. Underscore 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 underscore. The story of Timothy and Catherine Collins became a cautionary tale, one that resonated far beyond Greenwood. For some, it was a tragic example of how unchecked emotions could spiral into disaster. For others, it was a chilling reminder of the dangers of manipulation and deceit. In the end, no one truly won. A family was torn apart, lives were lost, and a quiet community was forever changed. But for those who followed the trial, one question lingered: who was the real monster, the man who had killed in a blind rage or the woman who had lit the fire? As the media moved on to the next scandal, Tim sat alone in his prison cell, replaying every moment in his mind. He had been a pawn, yes, but he had also been a willing player. And that, he realized, was a truth he would have to carry with him until the end. The Collins tragedy left a scar on Greenwood that would never fully heal. What had once been a picturesque suburban community became synonymous with betrayal, murder, and manipulation. Neighbors who had once admired the Collins family now spoke of them in hushed whispers, recounting the events like a cautionary tale told to warn against the fragility of human trust. Timothy Collins awaited his fate in the sterile silence of death row, a man hollowed out by the weight of his choices. Each day felt like an eternity, filled with the echoes of his own thoughts. He replayed every moment, Kate's betrayals, the confrontations, the murders, and questioned how he had allowed himself to descend into darkness. He no longer saw himself as the hero of his story, nor as a simple victim. He was both a perpetrator and a pawn, a man consumed by emotions he could neither control nor understand until it was too late. For Catherine, Kate Collins, prison was a different kind of purgatory. Stripped of the control she had once wielded so effortlessly, she now existed as just another inmate, her carefully curated facade shattered. Yet, even behind bars, Kate retained her chilling composure. She refused to acknowledge the pain she had caused, nor the lives she had destroyed. For Kate, the real tragedy wasn't the deaths of the men or even her husband's fall, it was that her plans had unraveled, exposing her true nature to the world. Their children, Sarah and Ethan, were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered family. Relocated to live with distant relatives, they grew up with a legacy they hadn't chosen but could never escape. For years, they avoided questions about their parents, refusing to let the sins of Timothy and Catherine define their lives. And yet, the shadow of what happened lingered, shaping their paths in ways they couldn't fully understand. Underscore 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 underscore. The story of the Collins family became more than a headline, it became a cautionary tale. True crime enthusiasts debated the case endlessly, dissecting every detail, every choice, and every motive. Psychologists pointed to it as a grim reminder of how unchecked emotions, manipulation, and a lack of communication could lead to unimaginable consequences. Was Tim solely to blame? Could he have resisted Kate's manipulation, or was he already teetering on the edge, waiting for a push? And Kate, was she simply a woman trapped in a loveless marriage, desperate for escape, or was she the cold, calculating villain who had orchestrated every step of this tragedy? These questions remained unanswered, but they left an impression on everyone who heard the tale. They forced people to look inward, to consider their own relationships, their own vulnerabilities, and the power dynamics that could shape their lives in subtle, dangerous ways. Underscore 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 underscore. What about you? If you were in Tim's position, how would you have reacted? Could you have seen through Kate's manipulation, or would you have fallen prey to the same emotions that consumed him? And Kate, was she truly the mastermind, or was she a victim of her own flawed choices? Could her actions ever be justified, or was she always destined to push those around her to the breaking point? We want to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Who do you believe is the real villain in this story? Do you think Tim deserved his sentence, or was he manipulated into actions beyond his control? Could Kate's sentence have been harsher, or was justice served? This story reminds us all of the power of trust, and the devastation that can follow when it's broken. Let us know your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe for more chilling tales of true crime and human complexity. Your opinion matters, and we'd love to continue the conversation with you.